the government's approach to this day has been to select teachers out of a school, take them out of the school, put them on a training course, and put them back into the school. Okay, and the goal for that is one teacher per school in the UK, which to me is a bit of like a drop in the ocean sort of thing. If you've got 1,500 students and you've got one trained member of staff, you're like, okay, that's not as effective as it could be. So my suggestion to the government through the petition was actually, we've got this infrastructure that's already set up through teacher training. If we agree that training teachers in mental health first aid is important for students and for staff, why not just sort of crowbar that in to teacher training so that every single teacher that passes through that teacher training will pick up the skills so they have the confidence and knowledge to be able to intervene and help people and talk about mental health in their classroom. That seems pretty obvious to me, and actually, as it turns out, it's pretty financially effective, as opposed to taking teachers out of the classroom.
Ben, it is a pleasure to have you on the platform. You're one of the UK's most engaged mental health campaigners. You've written a best-selling book and done so many amazing things, including with the UK government. So it's a pleasure to have you on the platform.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm really looking forward to having the conversation today about a really important topic, and obviously one that means a lot to me.
The first question I'd like to ask you is, please tell us about your childhood, growing up, and your journey to becoming one of the most UK's engaged mental health campaigners.
Yeah, I guess the most important aspect of my childhood to talk about first is the fact that mental health never featured in my upbringing. I'd never heard that phrase before. I didn't have any idea what that was. It's not something that ever was talked about growing up, because largely I was very fortunate. I grew up in rural Kent. Which is sort of Kent's described as the Garden of England, and that's essentially what my childhood looked like. We lived, amongst fields and farmland, and it was really just idyllic, like really, really perfect. I grew up with two other brothers. I was the oldest. Sam was 2 years younger than me, and the middle, and then Tom was 2 years younger than him, so the youngest. And it was us three brothers, and we spent most of our time just running around the fields, running and doing, having the most amazing time. Obviously falling out and arguing occasionally, as any brothers would do, but largely just sort of having a lot of fun. And then, we got into our teenage years, and unfortunately that fun sort of stopped. And Sam, my younger brother, was diagnosed with clinical depression, and that is the first time that mental health ever really enters my world, when I was 17 years old and being told that Sam had been diagnosed with clinical depression. And suddenly, there's the moment that I'm introduced to it.
And one of the most difficult parts of your story is at the age of 17, you lost your brother to suicide. Can you please
Yeah.
tell us a bit about how that affected you?
Yeah. So, I mean, as we've just talked about, mental health never came into my life really until Sam was diagnosed with depression. I was told, didn't know what depression was. I sort of thought, how can you be diagnosed with being sad? Like, how does that even work? And I really never spoke to him about it. And then in January 2018, Sam took his own life at the age of 15 years old. I was 17, and it was just the most horrific thing you could possibly imagine. I was, Me and my mum found him, which was just traumatic and awful. And then the days and weeks afterwards were just sort of quite numb, to be honest with you. Your brain doesn't really understand what's going on, and when faced with just this enormous pain, in my situation, as a lot of people say, it just sort of switched off emotionally. So I just didn't really feel much. And then sort of I went through the different phases of grief, intense anger at Sam, for like in just intense anger at how he could have done this to all of us, to feelings of just really, really awful feelings of guilt, and shame, particularly because I was his younger brother. I felt like I should have done something to stop it, or said something, or had I done something differently, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Um, and so that was a pretty awful emotion. And then you just sort of go through life and take each day by as it comes. And everyone tells you, time's the best healer and all of this. And I guess, I look back and this was 6 years ago now, and I'm certainly, I'm not feeling the emotions as intensely as I was back then, but they're certainly still there. And I have bad days. And I guess that's just the 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 immensity of the pain that it was caused when Sam died. It was just, I mean, I couldn't imagine anything worse than that. It's actually, in a weird way though, it's quite settling, because I can sit here and I can quite confidently say that I've probably had the worst day of my life, and nothing's ever going to be as bad as that ever again. And it does, in a really weird way, because I love finding silver linings. In a really weird way, it does make you feel quite confident about being able to deal with things later on in life, because I've had it. Essentially I've been hit as hard as you could possibly hit. So whatever comes next, I can sort of handle. So yeah, but it was just the worst pain you could possibly imagine. It was awful.
And one thing that's incredible about you, Ben, is that many people would be, completely defeated by something like this, but you've used this to help so many other people. So how did you find the strength to use such a traumatic situation to start this amazing mental health campaign?
It's a really interesting question, actually. I I I realized quite quickly that I wanted to help and essentially stop this from happening again. I lost my younger brother. It was an incredibly painful experience. And for me at the time, suicide felt like something that just shouldn't happen. It still does. I just don't see why we can't just stop that from happening. People that we know how to prevent suicide, and we know how to make people want to live again. So very quickly, I realized I wanted to do something positive, partly because I was desperate for something good. Uh, you know, if anyone's lost a relative or a loved one, you'll know that actually it's not a particularly fun time. People come into your house with flowers and offering hugs and crying, and I wanted something positive in my life again. So I wanted to do some campaign work and trying to improve this conversation around mental health, because it was a fun, positive thing to do. But also because off the back of Sam dying, a lot of people at school were telling me that they had stuff going on. I had people telling me that they'd been diagnosed with anorexia, people diagnosed with anxiety disorders, depression. People had told me they'd had suicidal thoughts, and I sort of took a step back and went, "Whoa, okay, this thing that I didn't even know was a thing is suddenly touching the lives of almost everyone I know." And I felt a real need to do something about that. Um, but it's interesting how you asked the question of, it's amazing to be able to use this to do something good. I honestly, I had a moment once where I received an award for my campaign work, and I sort of stood on the stage and everyone was clapping. Um, and it was obviously a lovely feeling, nice to get recognized, nice to have this sort of noted what I've been doing. But I had this feeling of, I know so many people that are on are going through what Sam went through because of a trauma or a bad thing happening in their life. And unfortunately, they found coping mechanisms that were unhelpful and unhealthy, drugs, alcohol, things like that. And the difference between me and that person is just luck. If I'm being honest, like I managed to find my way of coping, which was doing this campaigning stuff. I managed to do that because I had such a supportive network around me. It wouldn't have taken many things to be different for me to have actually found drugs or alcohol. Just after a few months after I lost Sam, I went to university. And there were drugs everywhere. Like if I'd been slightly different or reacted slightly differently, there was no reason why I couldn't have ended up in the same place. So I actually think it's a lot to do with luck, rather than strength necessarily. That I've ended up doing this. where I could have ended up with some really unhealthy coping strategies, which I've picked up along the way, but I've spent time with professionals and counselors to sort of rectify. But yeah, that's the reason I went into mental health campaigning, is because I wanted to do something, but also on a deeper level, I needed to do something. I needed something positive.
Thank you. And following on from the mental health in schools, an incredible thing that you've also done is you encouraged a campaign surrounding teachers having mental health first aid training. Now, this led to actually working with the UK government and the then Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. So please tell us about how you came up with this idea, because it's nothing that I ever heard of at school. So it's very innovative, very fresh, very new. So just please tell us a bit about it.
Absolutely. So this was really early on in sort of my campaigning career. So I was still at school. Sam had died at school. We were both at the same school, and I started talking to people at school quite soon after, and I realized that all these teachers that I was talking to were saying things like, "Oh, we see people struggling all the time, and I just don't know what to say, and I'm scared that I'm going to say something and make things worse." And it sort of dawned on me that teachers had no idea about mental health at all, right? They had absolutely no idea. They were willing, they wanted to help, but they didn't actually have the tools or knowledge or confidence to deliver that help. And so I started researching it and realized that actually the our approach to educating teachers on mental health is pretty unambitious. So for some context, if you want to become a teacher, you have to go through some level of teacher training to get a teaching a qualified teacher status qualification, which then means you can go into schools and teach. And as part of that teacher training journey, at no point are you required to learn anything about mental health. Okay, as standard. The government's approach to this day has been to select teachers out of a school, take them out of the school, put them on a training course, and put them back into the school. Okay, and the goal for that is one teacher per school in the UK, which to me is a bit of like a drop in the ocean sort of thing. If you've got 1,500 students and you've got one trained member of staff, you're like, okay, that's not as effective as it could be. So my suggestion to the government through the petition was, actually, we've got this infrastructure that's already set up through teacher training. If we agree that training teachers in mental health first aid is important for students and for staff, why not just sort of crowbar that in to teacher training, so that every single teacher that passes through that teacher training will pick up the skills, so they have the confidence and knowledge to be able to intervene and help people and talk about mental health in their classroom. That seems pretty obvious to me. And actually, as it turns out, it's pretty financially effective, as opposed to taking teachers out of the classroom. So yeah, I put a petition together. Lots of people agreed with me. I think we've got 325,000 signatures. Met Boris, who was very supportive of the petition. But as with a lot of things with government, things take a lot of time, and a lot of pressure. And so it never it we're still pushing for it. I'm still working with the Department of Education, still working with children's charities to try and get this change, which is relatively simple. I mean, it's literally just a change in the wording on the teacher training guided statutory guidance. So still working on it, but for me, it feels like the building block. If we want to create mentally healthy schools, training teachers isn't going to solve the problem overnight, but it feels like all the other things that we want to create have to be built on top of that baseline knowledge. So it's not the sort of eureka moment thing that's going to solve everything, but I think it's a really, really important first step that's just been overlooked for so long.
Other than the teacher training, what other interventions do you think could be put in place in schools to manage the mental health of students?
Oh, it's a great question. It's a great question. It's teacher training. I think what we need to do with schools is approach it very, very much like we've been approaching mental health in companies. So I work for a few companies and in sort of a consultancy role, and what we've done there really is widespread training, so we can upskill people's knowledge and understanding of mental health. That doesn't just mean mental health first aiders, but it means a general awareness of mental health and a knowledge of mental health. We've also got access to professional support in workplaces. So we've got access to things like counselling, on-site counselling, but also third party. So there's that little bit of removal. You're not. It doesn't feel like you're going something in-house. So if we sort of translating this back to schools, we need better mental health education for staff and students. So there's an elevated amount of awareness and understanding. We need access to professional support on site and off site. That's either through the NHS or through professionals on site on the schools. And that needs to be accessed easily. We also need to really have a think about flexibility. One of the best things, if we interview people right now about, one of the most important things for their mental health in the modern working world, actually flexibility is so important. That's just as important to children. We can look at the science and the research that shows us that actually a young person's brain needs sleep, right? And the fact that the school day starts at 8 a.m. doesn't give in a young person, particularly a teenager's life, doesn't give them the access to sleep that they need. So I would, if it was up to me, I'd shift the whole school day so it was a late start and a late finish, which fits much better into a young person's psychology and neurology. And so it's things like that. I think it's thinking outside the box, and actually, we really do need to tear apart our idea of education and rebuild it. Because we're seeing the problems that are stemming from that, school refusers, people not going to school because of anxiety and bullying and things like this, and the fact that actually school is not set up to be as helpful as it could be. So I would say we have to sort of have a real look at education and see how we're going to take that person at 5 years old and transport them through an education system that makes them by 18 the best version of themselves so they can be a really productive and happy adult. That's what schools are for. And at the moment, it doesn't feel like we're quite doing that. When you look at hospitals from 1940s, for example, and you compare that photo of a hospital in 1940 to a photo of a hospital now, it's almost unrecognizable the amount of progress and innovation that's been made in healthcare. You take a photo of a classroom in 1940 and you take a photo of a classroom in 2024 and put them side to side. And I think that's just a very quick, easy way of working out that actually we really not innovated in terms of how we educate people for a very long time, not in any major way. So I just think the whole education system needs to be rethought.
I think your point there is very pertinent because the Home Secretary actually said in an interview that was covered by The Guardian that young people have it much harder because of social media, knives, and mental health. So I know you've touched on this already, but what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think they're good points to make. I think social media for me is a really interesting one because on the one's hand of it, there are some real scary negatives. And access to sleep's really important. We can see from research and data that actually social media is having an impact on young people's sleep because people are staying up longer, talking to people online. Not necessarily the blue light. Actually, when you research blue light, it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of quality or amount of sleep. But the fact that you're online until 2, 3 a.m. When you've got to be up at 7 massively impacts your well-being. I think that's a really important problem. But then on the flip side for social media, I think actually social media gets a really bad, rightly gets a really bad PR at the moment, and people are very quick to sort of say that that's what's causing our problems. And I can see there are definitely aspects of social media that are really damaging. But when I speak to people that are vulnerable, that are not having a great time, actually social media can be a really positive place. It allows you to connect with people, and I think we need to sort of put down the pitchforks a little bit and just understand that there are two sides to this. There are the very real dangerous aspects of social media, but importantly, there are some really amazing aspects of technology and social media. The fact that we are in different parts of the world and able to have this conversation, I think, is just an amazing aspect of social media. It can draw people together, and I think we need to regulate social media. We need to have conversations about how we change our relationship with social media. But I don't think we should forget that there are some really amazing positives that can be taken from social media when we're dealing with loneliness in the scale that we are amongst children and young people. How can we create platforms that actually serve their users? There's a really good one that I downloaded the other day called Eight. It's financially ethical. The advertising's ethical. It's a brilliant example of social media done well. I think they're called We Are Eight. They're really great. From that point of view, I think there's definitely progress to be made to protect young people's mental health. But that is one issue as in a sort of sea of other issues that are affecting people's mental health. And I think it would be wrong to just microscope in on social media and say that social media is causing all the issues that we're seeing, when actually, when you look at the science and the research, there are some deeper problems that are existing, that social media maybe is sort of tipping it over the edge, but are certainly not the biggest problems that we're seeing in everyday life.
And I also wanted to touch upon your book. This book could save your life. Now, I actually read a few chapters and I was just blown away by some of the arguments you were making and how you broke down mental health. So, for my audience that might not have read the book, I'm going to ask you two questions. Firstly, what was the inspiration behind the book? And in your opinion, what are the three biggest misconceptions about mental health?
Those are great questions. The inspiration behind the book was my experience. You know, I sat down with my editor and the publishers, and I just said, I want to write a book that could be dropped in the lap of 14-year-old Ben that would change the outcome of my story. So I wanted to just go through. It's a sort of memoir slash self-help book. I wanted to go through my journey and sort of tell my story and be honest and look at the science and look at the data and explain what these things are, so that if it could have gone back to me or could have gone back to Sam, we could have normalized what was going on, had really important conversations. And that was one of the reasons I wanted to write the book. The other reason I wanted to write the book is this happens, suicide, it happens to people. I had no idea that it was ever going to happen to me or anyone I knew. And I really wanted to write the book because people should read about this. Chapter two, it was heartbreaking to read and heartbreaking to write, because it was sort of my recollection of that night in quite a lot of detail. And I remember having a conversation with my editor, and I was just like, this is the most important chapter of the book, because I think not enough people realize how close they are to experiencing what I've experienced, and people need to understand what's going on. We need to tell that story and show you how horrific it is. And only when we understand how horrific suicide is are we ever going to put the resources and attention into trying to stop it. Because we know that actually suicide prevention is a heavily, heavily underfunded area. So that was really the inspiration behind it, is that something needs to change both within ourselves and within society. And hopefully the book could be a catalyst for both of those things. And the biggest misconceptions around mental health, it's a really good question. The first is that having a mental illness makes you weak, or like you've done something wrong to deserve it. I've met so many people over the years, so many people that have diagnoses of mental illness, ranging from anorexia, eating disorders, to depression, anxiety, all the way through to schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder. So a whole spectrum of different diagnoses. Not a single person I've met in 6 years I would ever class as weak. These are the strongest, most resilient people I've ever met, because they are waking up to a brain that is in very often telling them to kill themselves, and they're not killing themselves. And in my books, that makes you an incredibly strong, resilient person. And it doesn't mean you've done something to deserve it. There are lots of reasons why someone might develop a mental illness, genetics being one. Things that are out of your control can develop mental health problems. So the idea that you have to do something to develop depression, or you have to do something to develop schizophrenia is just not correct. So these are strong people who very often um, almost every case that I've come across have just been very, very unfortunate and have developed an illness. And I think stigma comes from when we start thinking about it as a weakness or something that's wrong with them. And then the other misconception I think is really important to address is that actually we do have a lot of control over our own mental health and well-being. So that really there's two conversations to be had when we talk about mental health. There's mental health and mental illness, and they're different things. When you have a diagnosable mental illness, you need help from someone, right? You need guidance, you need external support. Just as if you were having heart disease, you can't solve heart disease with your 5 a day and a run occasionally, right? It's just not going to do anything. You need external support. But when we're talking about mental health, all of us have a lot we can do to improve it. And I think we often think of mental health as this fixed, static thing that we don't really have control over or agency over. When actually that's just not true. And we can do a huge amount to look after ourselves and elevate our mental health and resilience higher than it is now, through sort of training our emotions and training our psychology and self-help and all of these things. Really understanding what you can do that makes you feel happy and good and motivated and resilient is just going to change your life. It's just one of the most important things that all of us can do, and we really can improve your mental health. It's well within our abilities to do that, and I don't think enough people realize how much they can impact that by their actions day to day. If you can build healthy habits, you will see the outcome and reap the rewards of that, by buckets, when you can get that up to a good healthy level.
What are some of the healthy habits you adopt? Because you have this huge social media following, you're really out there. You're being interviewed by everyone from the BBC to ITV. How do you protect your mental health?
Yeah, good question. So, firstly, talk when things are bad. But I think we have this, particularly men, we have this idea that resilience is the absence of emotion or not expressing emotion. It's sort of resilience and that hard shell idea. For me, my definition of resilience is if you were to buy a sofa, right? And the sofa came and it said, this is a resilient sofa, right? That sofa needs to last many, 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 many years, right? That's my definition of what resilience is. So in my mental health, if I was to block off emotions and I was to not talk about bad things and I wasn't going to cry and I wasn't going to express emotions, I know because we can see the research and we can see the data, I'm not going to be healthy for as long. So therefore, that's not the definition of resilience, is it? Resilience is actually being healthy so you have that longevity and you can be healthy for longer. We know, therefore, that actually resilience and being healthy means expressing emotions, talking when things are bad, um, building healthy relationships with your friends, with your family. My girlfriend, if I have a bad day, I'm happy to go and talk to her, cry on her shoulder. My friends are exactly the same. We're quite good now at having that conversation and being like, how are you? How are you really? Like, let's talk about what's going on because I know you've had a difficult time. And really having those conversations can just bring some weight off your shoulders. And then in terms of like stuff I do for myself, I love running, exercise. A lot of people find exercise good for their mental health. I think what's really important though is understanding what about the exercise you enjoy, because you can very easily slip into exercising just for your physical health so you can look good, or some sort of aesthetic you're chasing. And if we're really being honest with ourselves, because of that pressure on our bodies and on how we look, there is a part of us which enjoys exercise because we want to look good, right? And so I have a rule where I'll do training runs because I want to get good at running, and I'll do training exercise, but I will also designate mental health runs and mental health exercise and well-being stuff, where actually my focus is on just having a good time. So if I'm having a bad day or a bad week, I'll go, well, I'm gonna have a mental health run. And that means leaving the watch at home, running around, going to my favorite place to run, which is Richmond Park from where I am, and literally just going there and seeing the deer or like running around and just exploring a new area and exercising, but doing something with it and enjoying the experience of doing it. And that's very different to a training run when you're trying to hit heart rates or hit weights on the gym. Like you don't get that ability to enjoy it as much. So that's how I look after myself through exercise. And then it's just prioritizing sleep, getting a pretty good diet. You have to be brilliant all the time. I still eat fast food sometimes, but just having some sort of um, just being mindful with what you're eating, how much you're sleeping, how much exercise you're getting, and just being able to clock in with your emotions. I'll have a sit down and sort of think, how am I doing at the moment? I know work's been busy. Like let's just check what's going on. Do I need to do anything? Do I need to cancel something and prioritize something else? Just sort of checking in with yourself is something that not enough of us do, and I think that's a really important thing that can really benefit your mental health. Understanding when you need to intervene and go for a mental health run.
And your point there was very pertinent because the Guardian actually wrote an article about mental health being a silent crisis affecting men. So what advice would you give to a man that is struggling to be vulnerable about the way how he feels and it's affecting his mental health?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the first advice I could give is it's normal to be scared of that and be a little bit nervous about sharing. It's actually still, I've been doing this job for 6 years, right? I've been telling my story for 6 years. I still find it really hard to talk about things that are going wrong because we're just wired to avoid that. And really, in everyday life, how many opportunities do we have to sit down with our friends and have a sad conversation about something bad that's going on? Actually, when we're spending time with our friends or family, we want to have a good time. And that doesn't mean talking about important things like emotions. So what I'd say then is dedicate time to those conversations. My favorite way of doing that is going to a friend. Do you want to just go for a walk? Let's go for a walk. I find walking a really good way of getting difficult conversations out. It feels less like you're being confronted by them because you're not sitting opposite looking at them like you would in a coffee shop. You've got privacy for a lot of the time. You're looking forward. It's quite a comfortable atmosphere usually. So go for a walk. That's a really nice way of doing it. Another brilliant way to have difficult conversations is in the car, driving for exactly the same reason. There's distractions. You're facing forward. It's not confrontational. Having a difficult conversation while you're driving is great. So from my biggest advice there is change the environment. You're not going to have a difficult conversation with your friends on Friday night in the pub. It's just not going to happen because you want to have a good time, right? So make the environment that you're going to feel comfortable opening up in. And then I have to say, it is just a case of counting to three and saying it. I'm really having a bad time. Do you mind if we chat about it? Because I think I'd like to get it off my chest. Or this has happened. I don't know what to do with it. I'd love your advice. Or I'd love to chat about it. Or on the flip side, if you're a friend and you're worried about someone else, do you want to go for a walk? Count to three and then ask it. I've noticed this in you. I've noticed you don't seem yourself recently. What's going on? Is everything okay? Would just open that conversation like that. And again, be mindful of the environment. Have you got privacy? Is it somewhere they feel safe and comfortable? Is it confrontational? And if you can get that right, it makes it easier. It doesn't make it easy. It makes it easier. And there is a certain amount of strength it takes to cross that barrier and get those words out. And so be kind to yourself if you are frightened or a little bit nervous about having that conversation because it is really difficult. It's really difficult to have.
And you actually do some amazing work with Wagamama and other companies on their DEI policies. What advice would you give to employers that want to create a safe space for employees to discuss their mental health concerns?
Yeah, it's a really good question. We've covered a lot of it there, but environment's really important. You'd be surprised. This hasn't happened in Wagamama per se, but in companies I've worked in that sort of want mental health to be talked about everywhere. And you imagine you've got hot desking office where all these tables are out and people are working and chatting in this really communal area. That's not a place where you're going to have a conversation about someone's life or stuff that's going wrong. So actually, it's being mindful of having those private, confidential spaces that people feel safe to have conversations in. Um, I'd say if you're an employer, it's easy to go down the training route and getting people trained. I think it's really important. I'm a mental health first aid instructor trainer, so I make mental health first aiders essentially. It's a really important qualification to have because it teaches people how to have mental health first aid conversations. What it isn't is your solution to mental health. You don't just do that and that's fixed. I'm a massive advocate for uh, being led by employees. Usually, they'll know what they need to be more happy and be more flexible and have a better time at work. Having some sort of open communication with them about their needs is really important in terms of building your sort of mental health policy and your structure in your company. Um, and the other important point here is a lot of people in this space think that it's a bottom-up problem. If we invest in the bottom, then it will sort of filter its way up through the business. That means training or access to gyms and things like that. That's not actually what we see in the real world. It's very much a solution that's top down. If you get CEOs and leaders and owners and managers who are vulnerable, who are a good example for work ethic and the work amount and a work-life balance. If you are a good example at the top, then it will filter down. And I've seen it time and time and time again. When you open difficult conversations with very senior people in front of their employees, their relationship with their employees changes. I'll give you an example. I was with a chief operating officer, and I interviewed him in front of 600 of his employees. And no one really, I mean, they knew him, but they didn't know him in a way that sort of knew much about his personal life. Anyway, he told this beautiful story about the fact that he was going through grief at the time when we were interviewing him. Was very honest about his struggles, very honest about how difficult it's been for him and his family. And you honestly, you could hear a pin drop in this room of about 500, 600 people. And that was just the most incredible thing because you saw this transformation of very like chummy, fun COO with his employees. And then after that conversation, after that interview, people had this new understanding of him. And if we can replicate that in businesses, people are going to be more likely to come to you when there's a problem. People are going to be more likely to be honest with you. People are going to feel safer and more comfortable at work when they have that deeper understanding of your vulnerabilities, because that's essentially what we need is people to feel safer and comfortable, more comfortable talking about what's going on. And obviously access to professional support, because as far as we can help people improve their mental health, when it falls into a diagnosis, that is what needs to happen. You can't eat your five a day and solve a diagnosis. We need that external support. So having some sort of access to professional support is really important to have that pathway.
And what are your hobbies outside of your work as a mental health activist?
To be honest, for a number of years, this took up most of my time. This sort of became my hobby and my work, and it still is. I love this. I love running. It's not just my exercise. It's my I absolutely love it. I just absolutely love it. I also race go-karts. So I did a lot of that at uni, and it's just so expensive. I'd love to keep doing it. But yeah, I do quite a lot of racing. Obviously watching Formula One, watching football, things like that. And then just seeing my friends is a hobby. I guess it's really interesting when you're a child and you're at school, like all your friends are around you. And even when you go to uni, if you go to uni, like you're amongst your friends, and then suddenly you go into the working world, and it's like you become an adult, and suddenly it's harder, much harder to see all of your friends at once. And so that's something I consider like a hobby of mine is just getting everyone together again and trying to get as much of that as possible because I think it can be really easy, particularly if you move away from where you lived and where your friends live, it can be really easy to lose contact with people. And we know that that's such an important pillar to mental health is that social support and social connection. So if I was to have a free evening and I could choose anything to do with it, it would either be running, racing, or seeing friends. And I think that's if I had to describe my hobbies, then that's probably what it would be.
And who are your favorite Formula One races? I don't know much about Formula One, but who are your favorite Formula One races?
So the driver that got me into Formula One was Daniel Ricciardo. So I'm always going to be a big Honey Badger fan. Unfortunately, I just don't think he's going to get the opportunity to be in a car that's going to be able to win races again, which is a shame. But I do love him. Um, love Hamilton, big Hamilton fan. Obviously from where I am in the UK as well, Kent, we're right next to Buckmore Park, and he tells some really great stories of racing around Buckmore Park and when he was a kid when he was like 5 or something. I'm what, 24? I could probably like 10 seconds off his time at Buckmore Park, but it's still nice. He's, to live and drive on tracks that he grew up driving is brilliant. So yeah, I'd say Hamilton and Ricardo.
That's brilliant. And also, I'd like to also ask, what are your favorite types of music to listen to?
I'm I don't really have a genre that I like. It's difficult to describe what I like from music. Sometimes I like rap. Sometimes I like whatever's on the radio, like pop music, um, rock, indie, whatever. It's really difficult to describe. I used to despise classical music. And now it's really growing on me. Sam was a really great musician, and he used to compose his own scores and his own music, and that was all classical. And it's very, very hard to listen to his stuff and not absolutely love it. And there is something really calm and very emotional about listening to classical music now. And so I've been lucky enough to go to a few concerts over the last couple of years, and I'm a big classical FM fan now in the car if I'm going somewhere. Just it's such a calming atmosphere. So I'm really anything. If I play me a piece of music, I either like it or I don't. There's not really like a genre that I or an artist I love over everyone else. It's just sort of I'm sort of very boring in that respect. I don't really have a an affinity. I'm just quite happy listening to music and sort of liking it or not. But classical is the one that's growing on me the most at the moment. It's just so lovely to listen to sometimes.
And I'd also like to ask, because you've done a lot of activism, even all over your social media. Sir Keir Starmer said that mental health will be a priority for his government. What areas of mental health would you like to see them prioritize during their first term?
Okay, yeah. So I'll pretend to be the Prime Minister. I'll pretend to be Keir Starmer. What would I do next? I think the first thing that we've got to sort out is healthcare. When we look at what's going on in professional support for mental health, it is it's devastating, really. And because I've got a sort of online audience and a bit of a presence, I do hear a lot of the horror stories, usually from parents that are quite desperate to get some sort of help for their children, and it's really, really hard to listen to. Um, there are a lot of people out there not getting anywhere near enough support for what they're going through. Um, the queue to CAMS, which is the Child and Adolescent Mental Health Service, it's the mental health service that looks after anyone under the age of 18. Their waiting list is about 500,000 people, children long. It can take for some people, it can take over a year to reach the front. It's a really, really, really dire situation. And like I've said throughout this episode, we can all look after our mental health by exercising, eating healthy, sleeping enough. But when you pass the threshold and you have a diagnosable mental health condition, what you really need more than anything is for professional treatment. And at the moment, because there's so few resources available, a lot of people are passing into that diagnosable zone and then not receiving the professional support that's going to help them get back. And unfortunately, the longer you leave it, the worse your symptoms and the harder it's going to be to get you to sort of treat and cure. Um, it's really, really quite scary, actually, looking at how things are going. But I would say we can prioritize that by incentivizing people to move into that role, because actually mental health is seen as a pretty awful place to work within the NHS. If you're going to study medicine at uni, is there a lot of attraction to working in the mental health space? Maybe for some, probably not for most. So how do we incentivize that role? How do we incentivize people to actually move into mental health and work and specialize in that? Um, and then it's a case of trying to sort of firefight problems until we can get the staff and funding that it needs. There's not enough mental health nurses, there's not enough beds. The beds that are available are too far away. You've got stories in the news of children being sent hours away from home because that's the only bed available to them. It's a pretty bad situation. And then after sorting out health, we need to sort of sort out education, and prepare children as best we can for adulthood. And that means teaching them about mental health, building healthy habits, building healthy coping skills, educating around mental health, educating around how they can look after themselves and others. And then slowly, if we can sort of develop those over the next 50 years, because it's going to take a very, very long time, then we can get into a position where actually we're starting to see that rate slow down or actually start reversing. So, and that would be amazing to start seeing that waiting list come down and the sort of rates of anxiety and depression and mental illness start coming down. But I don't think that. I think it's going to be a case of 50 years of work to get to that position, given how bad the situation is now. It's going to take a huge amount of focus and commitment. And unfortunately, as we know with so many issues, the government in this country, in our democracy, isn't set up to be a long-term government. They have 4 years when then they have to do another election. That's good and bad. The one thing it's bad for is having long goals, and long-term commitments. But unfortunately, with mental health, that's one of the biggest things we've seen is not enough people have committed enough in the short term to actually improve the long-term outcomes. There's been a lot of short-term gains, but at the expense of long-term progress. And I think with mental health, we need to start having conversations about how we're going to really think 20, 30, 40, 50 years in advance. Like, where do we want to get to? And let's start laying out the roadmap of how we get there. Let's not worry about what we're going to do next year. I mean, of course, let's worry about it, but let's also worry about what we're going to do over the next decade, 2 decades, three. How are we going to develop our country to be one of the most mentally healthy countries in the world? That's the sort of questions that I'd be asking if I was Keir Starmer. Even if that meant we might not be the ones to deliver it next government. Who knows? But that long-term thinking needs to be more common in Parliament, I think.
Thank you. And please can you tell us about any projects you're working on that you'd like to tell the audience about?
Projects I'm working on, teacher training. That's still going. If Bridget Phillipson's listening, please get in touch. No, we are. I'm still working on that. We're very much involved with other children's charities, getting some sort of getting some momentum behind that again so we can go back to the Department of Education and really start having that conversation about making a very small change that I think is going to have a huge impact in schools. Any other projects that's going on? That's really the focus for me at the moment, outside of sort of the sort of corporate work, and volunteering for various charities. For me, it is the most important thing. I've been doing this for 6 years talking about teacher training. Like, we've got to get it done. We've just got to get it done. It would be so simple for the Department of Education to introduce. I need to throw a lot of weight behind that. So I'm sure if you follow me on socials, you'll see a lot of that over the next few months, slash hopefully not, but slash maybe years.
And for everyone watching, how can they follow you on your social media?
Yeah, so I'm mainly on Instagram. You'll find me there as at I am Ben West. That's me.
Thank you, Ben. It has been an absolute pleasure to interview you. This interview has been so insightful, and I'm very grateful to have had you on my platform. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.